April 1945. The Pacific sun pressed down hard on the dust of a prisoner of war camp. The air smelled of canvas tents, boiled coffee drifting from the American guard post, and the faint rust of barbed wire. Behind the fences, dozens of Japanese women, former nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries taken in the last island campaigns, sat quietly, eyes averted, waiting for the familiar routine of count, rations, silence. But then something unthinkable happened. Instead of weapons, the American soldiers carried strange wooden sticks and battered leather gloves. They walked toward the open patch of ground near the wire and began marking a diamond in the dirt with boot heels. The guard spoke quickly, joking in English the prisoners barely understood, but their movements were not hostile. One GI spat tobacco, slapped his glove, and shouted a word unfamiliar yet soon unforgettable: baseball. Reports estimate that by 1945, over 6,000 female Japanese POWs were in Allied custody. Most of them had prepared themselves for hunger, humiliation, maybe violence. None of them had prepared for this. A few leaned forward, trying to catch the smell of the thick leather mitts. Others whispered, nervous. The weapons of war had been rifles and bayonets. Now the enemy wielded bats. NNTHE first ball tossed into the air cut across the silence. It wasn't just an object, it was a rupture. The arc glittered in the sunlight, drawing every pair of eyes upward, then down again as it landed with a dull thud in the pocket of a waiting glove. The crack of laughter from the Americans felt sharper than any command. From inside the fence, the disbelief grew. These were soldiers who had crushed Saipan, who had rolled tanks across Okinawa. Yet here they were, laughing like boys, carving a game out of scorched earth. One Japanese nurse later recalled in a memoir, "We had prepared for hunger, not for games." The scene unsettled them more than rations, more than captivity. It was kindness where they expected cruelty, play where they expected punishment. NNFOR long minutes. The women stood frozen, caught between suspicion and curiosity. A second ball went up, then a third. Each toss pulled them further out of silence, further into something they did not yet understand. The moment pressed tighter when an American turned, smiled, and gestured toward the fence. NNTHE invitation was unmistakable. And as the ball dropped neatly into the soldier's glove, Section 2 begins, when the first POW reached out to take her own. The American's gesture lingered in the air, hand open, glove dangling. The Japanese women hesitated. Stepping forward meant crossing an invisible boundary, not the barbed wire itself, but the wall of pride, fear, and memory that captivity had built around them. Yet curiosity pressed harder than command. Slowly, one young woman, a former nurse from Saipan, walked forward. The dust clung to her bare feet as silence followed her every step. NNTHEGI held out the glove. The smell of old leather rose sharp, mixed with sweat and sunlight. She touched it cautiously, as though it were a weapon disguised. When he nodded, she slid her hand inside. The rough stitching scraped her fingers. The glove heavy, alien. She clenched her fist, and the leather creaked. Around her, whispers erupted, half mocking, half astonished. And reports show that by 1945, the International Red Cross had shipped more than 24,000 sports kits to Allied camps, including gloves, bats, and balls. For the Americans, tossing gear to prisoners was a routine morale exercise. For the Japanese, it was cognitive dissonance sharpened into shock. Their own officers had never spared such items for amusement. Discipline and survival left no room for games. An ball arced toward her, spinning against the sun. Her instincts twitched: duck, defend, avoid. But the glove's padded pocket caught it with a dull smack. The sound drew a cheer from the Americans. She stared at her own hand in disbelief, as if she had captured a live animal. Again, one of them urged, tossing another. This time she fumbled, the ball slipping through her fingers, bouncing on the dirt. She bent quickly, cheeks flushed. Behind the fence, the other women covered their mouths, hiding laughter. For a brief second, the tension broke. Enemy accounts often describe these first touches as both humiliating and intoxicating. It felt like handling a weapon, but lighter, one survivor later wrote. The glove became a symbol, heavy with foreign power, yet offering safety instead of harm. NNTHE Americans kept tossing, slow, deliberate, patient. The nurses' movements grew steadier. Each catch drew louder claps from the guards, who seemed determined to make the foreign game into a bridge. What began with one woman soon pulled others forward, each eager to test the glove, to feel the strange magic of this sport. The sound of catching leather replaced silence in the camp, and with every toss, suspicion softened into something dangerously close to excitement. NNBUT, the true rupture came not with the glove, but with the bat. The sound of impact none of them could forget. The glove had broken the silence, but the bat shattered it. One American soldier, tall and loose-shouldered, stepped forward with a worn piece of wood in his hand. Its surface was scarred from use, but polished smooth where countless palms had gripped it. He planted his boots in the dirt diamond and called for a pitch. NNTHE ball snapped through the air, a blur against the bright Pacific sky. Then, crack! The sound ricocheted off barrack walls, sharp and metallic like a rifle shot. Yet nothing fell bleeding. Dust leapt from the ground as the ball skipped past the makeshift fence. For the Japanese women, the noise tore through expectation, the sound of destruction, but born from play. Nervous laughter erupted, some clutching their mouths in shock, others whispering. To them, wood had only meant cooking fires or the rough handles of shovels. Here, in enemy hands, it became joy. The guards whooped, slapping each other's shoulders, shouting words the women could not parse but understood through tone. Archival reports show that by 1945, the U.S. Army had shipped more than 50,000 bats overseas to service members. Baseball was not just recreation, it was culture carried like a flag. When soldiers set up a diamond in a POW camp, they were exporting America itself. The Japanese women, raised on rigid codes of silence and obedience, felt a cultural jolt, and one nurse whispered, "It sounds like wood breaking, but everyone is smiling." The contrast gnawed at them. For months, they had expected commands barked, punishments enforced. Instead, these men were laughing at failure, cheering mistakes, embracing clumsiness. It was a new form of discipline, rules without fear. NNTHE ball rolled back. Another swing followed, then another. Each impact drew louder claps, louder shouts. The POWs on the sidelines began leaning forward, curiosity cutting through shame. The rhythm of the game was hypnotic. Toss, swing, crack, cheer. Even the barbed wire seemed to fade into the background as attention locked onto the flying ball. NNBY late afternoon, the open space near the barracks was no longer empty. Prisoners from other compounds, Germans, Italians, and Japanese men, pressed against the fence, drawn by the alien thunder of bats and laughter. The sound carried across the camp, pulling strangers into a shared spectacle. What began as an odd diversion now swelled into a gathering crowd, a makeshift stadium. And as the voices grew louder, the barriers of nationality and defeat began to blur. The rhythm of bat and ball had spread like a signal flare. Soon, the quiet corners of the camp began to stir. Prisoners who had spent days staring at the ground lifted their heads. German POWs, curious and restless, drifted closer. A few Italians leaned against the wire, arms folded, half amused. And then the unexpected. Japanese male prisoners, gaunt and silent, pressed their foreheads against the mesh to watch the strange game unfold. NTHE field itself was little more than a patch of dust and trampled grass, yet the sound of laughter made it feel vast. A crack of wood, the thump of a glove, the low cheer of the Americans, it was contagious. Even the guards, usually stiff, allowed themselves grins, stepping back from their rifles to clap along. NNBY 1945. Allied records list more than 425,000 Axis prisoners held in U.S. camps alone, not counting those scattered across the Pacific. Sports became one of the simplest tools of control, a way to siphon tension, to replace barbed silence with structured rules. Baseball, with its clear innings and visible order, fit perfectly. What no one expected was how magnetic it would prove across cultures. One German prisoner muttered in broken English, "Always games, these Americans." An Italian nearby chuckled, nodding. For the Japanese women, hearing laughter from enemies and allies alike created a surreal overlap. In their world, Germans had been partners, Americans mortal enemies. Yet here, they were all spectators to the same crack of a bat. Nurse from Nagoya whispered, "For a moment, the war disappeared." The words carried down the line, passed like contraband, and no one dared contradict her. Watching the game eroded the rigid categories: guard versus captive, ally versus enemy. On the dirt diamond, the only divisions that mattered were pitcher, batter, catcher, and in the women's posture changed. Where once they crouched in shadows, now they stood straighter, leaning forward, eyes tracking each throw. They were no longer invisible prisoners. They were participants in a shared scene. Some even clapped softly when a batter connected, surprising themselves with the impulse. And then, another shock. While the game unfolded, a GI returned from the barracks, carrying supplies not of war but of comfort. On the bench beside the players, he placed boxes, small paper packets with cigarettes, candy, and sticks of gum. The sweet scent drifted across the fence, sharper than the smell of dust. NFOR women who had survived on thin rice gruel. The sight of chocolate and tobacco felt more jarring than the game itself. The game slowed as the soldier set the boxes down on the rough wooden bench. A cloud of dust lifted as he kicked the lid open. Inside, the treasures gleamed under the late sun. Shiny packs of Lucky Strikes, foil-wrapped Hershey bars, and the striped paper sleeves of chewing gum. The Americans handed them out casually, as if these luxuries were no more important than spare nails. NNTHE Japanese women watched in disbelief. Cigarettes had been rationed tightly in their homeland. Many had gone months without a single puff. Chocolate was almost mythical, spoken of but never seen. Now, here in captivity, they were offered the things even Tokyo officers rarely touched. One GI unwrapped a Hershey bar and broke it into squares, pressing the melting pieces into hesitant hands. A prisoner's lips trembled as she tasted it. Bittersweet, rich, overwhelming. Reports indicate that Allied camps distributed over 7 million cigarettes monthly through Red Cross parcels and army supplies. Tobacco, gum, and candy became everyday currency in a world where normal money meant nothing. To the prisoners, this abundance felt unreal. "Our officers never gave us such luxuries," one survivor later admitted. The comparison was damning. In the Empire's army, gifts were replaced by punishments. Here, the enemy extended sugar and smoke. Some women hesitated, unsure if accepting was a trap. But when they saw guards lighting cigarettes for fellow POWs, their suspicion cracked. One exhaled, the smoke curling upward like a fragile banner of surrender. Another bit into a Hershey square, the chocolate softening against her teeth. For the first time in months, her hunger did not ache. An NTHE soundscape of the camp shifted. No longer only the thud of leather and wood, but the crinkle of wrappers, the hiss of matches, the faint hum of chewing. The Americans lounged easily, sharing their rations with captives as if the war were paused, as if the barbed wire had lost its sting. NNBUT abundance carried its own sting of memory. As the sweetness spread across their tongues, the women remembered what they had eaten before capture: thin rice gruel, a few pickled vegetables, barely enough to sustain. The contrast was brutal. In their homeland, shortages had stripped civilians down to bone and silence. Here, as prisoners, they tasted plenty. NNTHE moment was intoxicating. but also haunting. Because with every bite, a deeper question gnawed. How could the enemy's prisoners eat better than Japan's free citizens? The sweetness of the chocolate lingered, but it was the steam rising from a nearby mess tent that drove the next wave of disbelief. The Americans carried tin mugs filled with black coffee, the bitter aroma cutting through dust and sweat. Alongside, thick bread crusts, butter glistening faintly, passed into the hands of guards who tore them without ceremony. The prisoners watched every bite with a mixture of hunger and shame. Japan's wartime kitchens had shrunk to bowls of watery rice, sometimes flavored with millet if lucky. In 1945, famine loomed large. Statistics show the empire imported nearly 90% of its wheat before the war, and the Allied blockade had choked supplies dry. Civilians starved in the home islands, some surviving on acorns and grass. For the female POWs, memories of thin rations and hollowed stomachs were as fresh as the bruises on their wrists. Now, inside a camp meant for captives, the smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread assaulted them. One nurse whispered, "Even prisoners eat better than free civilians." It was not exaggeration. Red Cross parcels provided steady deliveries: canned meat, powdered milk, jam, sometimes even fruit. The contrast was almost cruel, proof that Allied abundance extended even into captivity. NNTHE women exchanged glances heavy with disbelief. Their empire had demanded obedience, sacrifice, and silence. Their officers measured honor in deprivation. Yet the enemy, supposedly brutal, handed out surplus calories, as though it cost nothing. The shame pressed hard. Was victory really possible when even rations betrayed such inequality? NNTHE crack of the bat in the distance reminded them that the game continued. But for the women near the bench, the bread and coffee became the greater spectacle. One reached out as a guard offered a crust. She took it cautiously, tearing off a piece, feeling its warmth against her lips. The taste was rich, comforting, humiliating. She swallowed, then glanced away, hiding tears she couldn't explain. Another twisted memory. She thought of her younger brother in Nagoya, waiting in ration lines for half a sweet potato. She thought of her mother boiling weeds for broth. Here, in captivity, she ate more in a single sitting than her family did in days. NNTHE realization cut deeper than the barbed wire. It wasn't just food. It was proof of a different world, and that world's rules, the Americans explained next, were written in the language of baseball. The bread and coffee had softened suspicion, but it was the game that reshaped their thinking. The Americans gathered the women near the diamond, bats resting on shoulders, gloves dangling loose. A sergeant squatted in the dirt, sketching lines with a stick. Circles, bases, arrows. He tapped 3 times, then raised 3 fingers. 3 strikes. His tone was firm, but patient, more teacher than guard. NNTHE women exchanged uneasy glances. Rules, in their world, had always come barked with punishment. Obedience meant survival. Here, the rules arrived with explanation, gestures, even laughter when confusion lingered. One POW attempted a swing and missed by several feet. Instead of shame, the Americans clapped and shouted encouragement. The lesson was strange, disarming. Archival records confirm that baseball manuals and rule sheets were shipped inside Red Cross sports parcels for camps across Europe and the Pacific. Allied officers believed structured play reduced unrest. Yet for these women, the structure meant something more, a glimpse of discipline without fear. An American umpire demonstrated loudly, strike, ball, foul. His voice rose and fell in rhythm, commanding without menace. One prisoner muttered to another, discipline without fear. This was new. She held the bat tighter, adjusting her stance. When the next pitch came, she connected faintly, a weak dribble toward the dirt. Still, the cheers rose. Her chest tightened at the absurdity. Applause from the enemy. NNTHE women began repeating the rules aloud in broken accents, trying to mimic the English words. Some laughed at their mistakes. A guard, amused, mimed the motions again, his shadow long across the field. For once, correction came not with a slap, but with patience. The absurdity was undeniable. Barbed wire still ringed them, but inside that circle, another kind of order existed. Every throw, every call of safe or out carried more than sport. It carried a cultural code, one built on fairness, clarity, and consequence without cruelty. It clashed with their training, their upbringing, their entire understanding of authority. NNBY late afternoon, the game had gained rhythm. The women swung faster, caught cleaner, moved with less hesitation. The umpire's hand signals were no longer foreign but part of their own motion. The strange rules had been absorbed. And then came the moment that changed everything. When a quiet nurse gripped the bat, swung with all her strength, and sent the ball screaming past the infield. The bat whistled through the air, connecting with a sound louder than anyone expected. The ball streaked low and fast, cutting across the dusty field before rolling beyond the makeshift infield line. For a heartbeat, silence froze the camp. Then came an eruption. Applause, whistles, and shouts from the Americans. Even the POWs pressed against the fence leaned forward, eyes wide. NNTHE hitter, a young nurse barely 20, stood rigid, stunned by her own strength. She had grown up in Nagoya, taught to keep her voice quiet and her posture lower than men. War had thrust her into uniform as a support worker, not a soldier. Yet here, under the enemy's gaze, she had struck clean, her body producing power she didn't know it contained. NNTHE Americans cheered without hesitation. One GI pounded his glove, yelling, "That's a hit!" Others clapped loudly, grinning as though victory itself had just been scored. For the women watching, the reaction was almost more shocking than the swing. They had been trained to expect rebuke for overstepping boundaries, to anticipate ridicule when they failed. Instead, the enemy celebrated their success as if it belonged to everyone on the field. Historical records suggest some POW women had been exposed to Western culture before the war, particularly those who studied in Manila or worked in international schools. Reports note that a minority had glimpsed baseball years earlier, though never as participants. Here, that faint memory surfaced, and the nurse's swing proved that skill could survive even in captivity. Another prisoner whispered, "We thought weakness was expected of us." The words cut through the group, echoing in thought if not aloud. For once, strength was not punished but praised. It chipped at the certainty that obedience and silence defined their worth. NNTHE nurse jogged awkwardly toward the base, dust swirling around her feet. American soldiers gestured wildly, signaling her to run faster, their voices filling the air with laughter and instruction. She stumbled onto the bag, nearly falling, but the eruption of applause covered the clumsiness. Her face flushed, half in embarrassment, half in something she had not felt since capture. Pride NTHE game continued, each swing carrying more confidence, each catch steadier. Yet it was not just technique improving, it was identity shifting. The women, once invisible captives, now felt themselves acknowledged, equal in at least one realm. And with that realization came an even deeper shock. The game was rewriting how they saw themselves, not just how the enemy saw them. The dust still hung in the air as the nurse stood panting on the base, clutching the bat like a weapon she no longer feared. Around her, Americans clapped, soldiers whistled, and even rival POWs nodded at the display. It wasn't the hit itself that mattered, it was the recognition. In that moment, she wasn't a defeated enemy or a prisoner in rags. She was simply a player who had earned respect. NNFOR, the other women. The sight struck deeper than the sound of the bat. They had been taught since childhood that silence and compliance marked their value, especially in the military hierarchy. In Japan's wartime culture, strength in women was often ignored or punished. Yet here, across barbed wire and dust, The enemy did something their own officers never had. They celebrated female strength. And one diary later recalled, "Here, they cheered our strength, not our silence." The words became a quiet mantra, repeated among the prisoners long after the game ended. It was an identity shock, more profound than the food, the cigarettes, even the abundance. Recognition, not pity, not indulgence, but honest recognition, undid them more than chains had. Statistics remind us that over 30,000 women served in Japanese support roles during the war: nurses, clerks, auxiliaries. Many endured constant reminders that their labor was secondary, their voices unimportant. But on this makeshift diamond, the framework inverted. The Americans did not treat them as background or burden. They treated them as equals in the rhythm of play. NNTHE, prisoners began slapping each other's gloves, imitating the gestures of camaraderie they saw among the GIs. Laughter spilled, tentative at first, then freer, as though language itself were no longer a barrier. Even when a swing missed, the Americans shouted encouragement instead of derision. The women learned quickly that failure here was not disgrace. It was part of the rhythm. A few sat back, overwhelmed, unable to reconcile the scene. For them, the applause carried an undertone of loss. If equality could exist here, in captivity, why had their own nation denied it? Why had their sacrifice been measured only in silence and obedience? The contradiction ached. Yet before reflection could settle, the air trembled. Shadows swept across the diamond. Engines growled from above. Heads turned skyward as the unmistakable hum of bombers rolled through the camp. The women's laughter faltered, drowned by memory they could not escape. The sound of engines deepened, a heavy drone that swallowed the cheers. Heads tilted upward. Against the clear Pacific sky, dark silhouettes glided in formation. Bombers, their wings slicing sunlight into shadow. The game froze. The bat slipped from the nurse's hand, thudding softly into dust. Every prisoner's chest tightened at once. NNFOR the Americans. These planes meant dominance, a shield in the sky. For the Japanese women, they were ghosts of terror. Just weeks earlier, those same shapes had rained fire over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Reports estimate over 100,000 civilians killed in the March 1945 Tokyo raids alone, entire neighborhoods incinerated in hours. The women did not see harmless practice flights. They saw homes collapsing, mothers burning, siblings screaming under falling roofs. A hush blanketed the camp. The laughter that had bridged language moments ago evaporated into silence. Some women covered their ears instinctively, bracing for explosions that never came. Others dropped into crouches, their bodies conditioned by months of bombardment. Even the strongest among them felt tears threaten as memories surged raw. One whispered shakily, "The sound carried us back to ruins." Her words, though barely audible, captured what spread through all of them. Baseball gloves and chocolate bars vanished from their minds. Instead, they stood again on smoldering streets, ash sticking to skin, air filled with screams and smoke. NNTHE Americans noticed the shift. Their easy grins faltered as they watched the prisoners recoil, hands trembling, eyes refusing to leave the sky. A GI lowered his glove, realizing that for the women, the bombers overhead were not symbols of safety, but reminders of annihilation. NNTHE diamonds seemed smaller, fenced not by wire but by memory. The nurse who had struck the clean hit moments earlier now hugged herself, shoulders shaking. The pride she'd felt collapsed under the roar of engines. It was a cruel reminder that joy was fragile in captivity, always at risk of being swallowed by ghosts of war. Yet silence could not last forever. The Americans, sensing the weight, tried to pierce the dread. One soldier exaggerated a strikeout motion, flailing wildly with the bat. Another toppled over in mock defeat, boots kicking in the dust. Slowly, the absurdity of their antics cut through fear. A faint giggle slipped out from the fence line. Then, another NNTHE bombers faded into distance, leaving behind echoes of terror, but also an opening. And into that opening, humor pushed its way in. The roar of the bombers still lingered in their ears when an American private stumbled theatrically, bat spinning out of his hands. He clutched his chest as if struck by an invisible ball, then collapsed into the dust, groaning with mock agony. His comrades burst out laughing, slapping their knees, shouting playful insults. The prisoners blinked, startled. Slowly, one woman covered her mouth, trying to hide a smile. NNTHE soldiers pressed harder. Another GI exaggerated a strikeout, whiffing so wildly he tumbled backward, cap flying off. Dust clung to his sweaty forehead as he sprang up, bowing with ridiculous dignity. The absurd performance cracked the tension. A nervous giggle rippled from the fence line, then grew louder, until several women laughed openly, their voices mixing with the Americans' boisterous shouts. Archival camp studies confirmed that organized sports programs reduced anxiety and unrest among POWs. But it wasn't just the game itself, it was the humor layered into it. Where Japanese officers had barked orders, these Americans turned mistakes into comedy. Where silence had been enforced, laughter now echoed freely. NNFOR the women, this laughter carried more weight than rations or chocolate. It was a medicine they hadn't realized they craved. In Japan, wartime life had squeezed humor out of the public sphere. Smiles felt treasonous, jokes dangerous. Here, even in captivity, laughter was encouraged. It was not a weakness, it was survival. In one POW later wrote, "Laughter was forbidden in our war, yet it healed us." The memory of that moment, the bat twirling from a soldier's hands, the exaggerated collapse, remained etched more vividly than the food they ate that day. For a few minutes, fear loosened its grip. NNTHE Americans noticed too. They leaned into the comedy, slipping in playful shouts of "safe" and "out" with grand arm gestures. Each mistake became another chance to laugh, not to scold. The women began clapping along, some shouting broken English words they barely understood. Their smiles widened, tentative but real. NNTHE mood shifted. Where silence had reigned, the camp now hummed with shared amusement. The bombers overhead became background noise in memory, replaced by the ridiculous images of soldiers tumbling in dust. And yet, as the sun dipped lower, the mood coalesced into something more structured. The laughter subsided, the game resumed, and with it came the final act, a last inning that would leave its own lasting memory. As the shadows lengthened across the diamond, the laughter softened into focus. The game was no longer just a diversion, it had become an event. Prisoners and guards alike leaned forward, eager to see the conclusion. Dust clung to sweat-dampened uniforms, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and coffee. The Americans clapped their hands together, calling out, "Last inning!" NTHE score meant little, yet both sides played as if victory mattered. The Japanese women swung harder, their feet shifting confidently in the dirt. The GIs pitched faster, gloves snapping with precision. Every catch, every miss, drew cheers from both fences and benches. The strange equality of sport had taken hold, suspending rank, uniform, and wire. NN statistics tell us that a regulation game runs 9 innings and roughly 2 hours. Inside the barbed perimeter, time flowed differently. Minutes stretched, suspended by each pitch. No one asked about rations or roll calls. They asked only, "Who's up next?" Then it came, the swing that no one expected. The same young nurse who had shocked everyone earlier stepped to the plate again. Her stance was firmer now, shoulders squared. The pitch cut low, fast. She swung with all her strength. The crack of impact split the air like thunder. The ball arced high, clearing the improvised fence line. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the camp erupted. Americans leapt to their feet, clapping and shouting. Prisoners, even those who had stayed stone-faced, gasped in unison. The nurse stumbled into motion, running bases as if chased by ghosts, dust rising with each frantic step. By the time she reached home plate, the applause had swallowed every trace of hesitation. For a moment, the fences vanished. The barbed wire melted into nothing but background. One German prisoner muttered, half in awe, "She hit it clean." An Italian grinned, echoing the sentiment. And the Japanese women, usually so restrained, clapped loudly, voices rising above their shame. The final play belonged to all of them. NNTHE bat dropped, the game ended, and the players, guards and captives alike, stood in an exhausted silence broken only by breath. It was not triumph, not defeat, but something entirely foreign. Shared joy. And as the dust settled and the bats were stacked against the barracks wall, the women's faces carried the glow of transformation. And yet, when night descended, the real reckoning would come, not with bats or balls, but in whispered memories that refused to fade. Night fell slowly over the camp, the Pacific sky glowing faintly before surrendering to darkness. The diamond was empty now, its chalk lines scuffed into nothing but dust. Bats leaned against the barracks wall, gloves stacked in a pile, silent witnesses to what had unfolded. From inside the wooden huts, whispers spread, fragments of the game retold in hushed voices, laughter replayed like stolen treasure. NNTHE, Japanese women lay on straw mats, replaying the sound of the bat's crack, the feel of leather against skin, the taste of chocolate melting on tongues unaccustomed to sweetness. Their bodies were still bound by fences, their status unchanged, yet something within had shifted. Captivity was not just deprivation, it could also be transformation. Archival surveys show that over 70% of former POWs later recalled cultural exchanges more vividly than combat itself. Food, music, games, these moments of humanity outlasted memories of roll calls and punishments. For the women in this camp, baseball became more than a foreign pastime. It was proof that identity could bend, that strength and laughter could survive, where silence once ruled. One remembered thinking, the game rewrote who we thought the enemy was. In their minds, Americans had been caricatures of brutality, faceless invaders bringing fire from the sky. Yet here, the same soldiers cheered for their hits, shared cigarettes, and bowed jokingly after strikeouts. It was a paradox too deep to ignore. An NTHE fence still loomed outside, sharp wire catching moonlight. But inside the huts, the women no longer felt as invisible as before. They were not just captives, they were players in a memory that could not be erased by hunger or fear. The war would continue, bombs would still fall, but this small collision of cultures carved its own lasting scar. NNFOR, the Americans. It had been a diversion, a way to pass hours in a lonely outpost. For the Japanese women, it was nothing less than identity shock. Baseball, rations, laughter, all stitched together into an undeniable truth. Humanity had survived the war, even here, even now. NNTHE guards extinguished their lanterns. Darkness settled fully across the camp. And as the women drifted into uneasy sleep, one sound lingered strongest in their dreams, not the bombers, not the fences, but the clean, impossible crack of a bat sending the ball into open sky.